besides that, I now want to welcome one of the main organizers, actually, of this conference to this stage. Welcome, Florian Rappl.
Hello.
How are you doing, Florian?
Very nice to be here.
First of all, thanks a lot for all the efforts you've put into this conference. I think I can speak for everyone that attended this conference. We very much appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Just a quick introduction. Florian is a solution architect here at SmartBuild in Munich, and he's specialized in the creation of scalable distributed web applications. And he's the creator and main contributor of the Micro Frontend framework Piral, which we've already heard a couple of times today in different talks. Furthermore, he's the author of the book, The Art of Micro Frontends, which you can actually also win during the raffle after this talk. So stay tuned for that. Today, he will introduce a very exciting and new project he's been working on that makes it actually possible to use Micro Frontends anywhere you want. Painless Micro Frontend Orchestration with Picard. Have fun with the closing keynote, Florian. The stage is all yours.
Thanks a lot, Felix. Thanks for the kind words. I think this whole event here would not be possible without the outstanding team at SmartBuild here. Everyone who's contributed either as moderator or also behind the scenes, so tech with the nice cake and everything. I guess that was a really nice and very well done organization by everyone. And also, of course, much appreciated to all the speakers. But we're not there yet at the closing words. What I want to present you is a project that I've been, let's say, tinkering with for the last couple of months, and that is now finally very close to being released. We will not release it today, so I can already spoil that. We will not hit the release button this time, but it is very close to being hit. And what I want to do with this talk today is to open up a dialogue if what you see there makes sense, if it solves a problem, or if it's just a useless thing that doesn't have any existence, justification whatsoever. So here I really want to open the dialogue. But before I do that, also a few words about myself from me. With everything that you heard from Felix, I want to encourage you also to always reach out to me if you have any problem in the area of scalable front-end development. We are always eager to hear you, getting a dialogue, and maybe have one or the other project together. That's why we are here and why we can be hired. So always get in touch. You have my LinkedIn profile always written on the bottom. Just write me a message and we are good. With that being said, what is the state of Micro Frontends? And I don't want to give another, let's say, a whole keynote as last year. So that's why I want to make it brief and just look at a couple of the technologies that we have out there and that are being used and what they are actually solving. So on the one hand, we of course have component models being out there and being, let's say, fully grafted. On the client side, we are mostly dealing with single spar, for instance, which brought up this generalized component model, mount, unmount, update, bootstrap, maybe all these lifecycle methods in there in a universal component model. But this is, of course, not the only effort. We, of course, have something like OpenComponents, for instance, which brought that even earlier and has specialized on the server side to bring a universal component model that can be used for rendering micro frontends. Now, if you look a little bit further and say, well, okay, this is maybe the life cycle of components, maybe you need that, maybe not. But what you may need in general is, of course, how do you now compose these micro frontends? How do you load them? And especially, how do you make it possible that they share dependencies among each other, which of course is a controversial topic. I don't think there's something like share nothing or share all. The truth always lies, of course, in the middle. Some dependencies you might even need to share due to technical constraints. So these technologies are certainly needed. And what you have here is, for instance, a native approach, as sketched on the left-hand side with native federation using import maps and ESMs. And of course, something more, I'm always saying, or will say in this talk, Webpack module federation, but make no mistake, it's now in the stage of moving out. We have support already in ES build, in Vite, And of course, our spec is a very close one. So this gets broader and broader. So always when I talk about Webpack Module Federation, what I mean, of course, is Module Federation. That being said, this is the other aspect that you can use. And then, of course, you might have even things like Piral that, of course, I can't dismiss on my own slides, which uses, for instance, SystemJS, but is compatible also, for instance, with Webpack Module Federation. So you could write a pilot just using a Webpack and Module Federation or iSpec and Module Federation and ship it and go sideline the whole Piral tooling if you want to. And it would also just work because, yeah, it can leverage and is compatible with the runtime. Okay, so we have this component model figured out, sharing and loading is figured out, and Piral, of course, brings all these things already for loose coupling and combines all this into one package. So we have a universal component model in there, and of course, ways to share and load dependencies and micro frontends. So all is cool, or we can go home. Technically, everything is solved, and as we heard in the opening keynote by Luca, the real problem is not in the technical area. So what am I doing here? What's the problem? Now, there are certain things you can bring up which won't be solved technically at the moment, or will be very difficult to achieve technically. Again, if I write Webpack here, you can replace it also with RSpec or anything compatible with Webpack Module Federation. So in order to consume a Webpack Module Federation micro frontend, you would need also a compatible process, meaning that you would need, for instance, another Webpack bundled solution there, right? This is not so easy, as we heard, of course. We're now extracting out the runtime of Module Federation, but yeah. What about native federation, for instance? Could we use just native federation and Module Federation? They both have federation in the name, so it should work, right? No, does not compute here. It does not work. And so, of course, once you, from your architecture point of view, decided for one or the other technology is ruled out. And even though you might now say this is a rather, let's say, esoteric case here, this is not real world, let's pick this example. You wrote a micro frontend using Webpack Module Federation, and now your classic team approaches you and says, this thing is cool that you delivered. We have a PHP rendered site and we want to include your micro frontend there. What will you tell them? Will you tell them, well, it will work, but you first need to have extra tooling, maybe then combine it into a new script, embed that script, have all these extra steps, who's maintaining that script? How do you now bring it there? Can't they just do that already? Do they now need to know what you use as a component in your microphone? A lot of questions will arise. You will not have the answer to all of those questions naturally. And in general, it will be very hard to use it just from any technology. Even though the thing where would you use it, client-side rendering in this example, would still be the same. It would be very difficult for this team to bring it in. So we require a compatible host for sure. And you might say, okay, that's one issue. We can maybe live with that. Fine. Let's look at another thing that you might say is interesting or not. You start with your Webpack-powered application, and this is a single-page application, of course. And you include, of course, your micro frontend, now written again with compatible technology. So Webpack it is here, Webpack is there, all cool. But now, what if another team approaches you and says, okay, we are also using Webpack, but we are using it a different process. We have now Next.js, for instance. Okay, so this is server-side rendering, and your next answer would be there is something for Webpack, but it works a little bit differently, and you would need to produce the micro frontend again. That wouldn't be a good answer, though. So potentially, yeah, you will look for something else, and maybe the end result will be that in your Webpack process, therefore, for instance, Next.js in this example, you would change it that only, let's say, for the client-side bundle, the Module Federation micro frontend would be loaded, and it would take care of it. Maybe that it's not appearing in RSC or a React server-side render component, but only in the one that appears in the client side. Nevertheless, wouldn't it be much nicer when at least with what is within the microfront, it doesn't have any constraints on the client. It would also just work. So do we really have to think about that the error doesn't work or what's inside? It should be rather what's inside that matters and not the outside technology, right? So that should allow that we just use it on multiple environments, because at the moment, it's not so easy to make this transition, right? There's no environment transition possible. And finally, and this is now more of a problem of Piral that I see, but one that, of course, is motivational for me to actually come up with this new project is Piral itself brings already a lot of things to the table. But one of the things that might block you from either knowing Piral or using Piral is that it comes with an app shell that requires you to have React in there. Now, this React part, of course, can be rather minimalistic, and maybe you don't have any layout in there whatsoever, but nevertheless, you would have it. And whatever you do, you have this package. Well, historically, we had a package called Piral Base. We still have this, but this package, never really paid off for us, in that sense that it allowed either us or anyone else to place useful systems on it, right? So you always had at least Piral core, but then you have React already in there, and that's not good, right? So you want to maybe have something without React. Because right now, believe it or not, Piral is used a lot, for instance, with Angular-powered microfrontends, and even maybe in some teams that are only using Angular-powered microfrontends. So there is still then React in there, but only in the app shell. And the question, of course, would be, what if we change the app shell to run on Angular? And of course, in the picture that I've drawn, we swapped now places, and now this Angular-powered app shell might use React, but it could, of course, then much more easily use other Angular-powered microfrontends. And it would allow certain things. But again, at the moment, not possible, because even though there are some techniques where you can bring Angular directly into the app shell, there will always be this React part in there, and you can't strip it out. And that's, in my opinion, a problem we want to get rid of. This problem can, of course, be summarized as framework dependency. We don't want to be framework dependent. We want to be independent. So what if we just start with HTML? HTML is good. HTML is great. Some people will tell you, oh, server-side rendering or plain HTML is all you need. So what if we just start with HTML? We covered all of the cases that we've seen. For instance, PHP that uses HTML, right? So yeah, HTML is great. So all you would need to do is just reference a script. And that's it, right? No bundler needed for that, so no additional tooling or anything. All you need to do is drop a single line of script, like what you do with HTMX, what you do with Alpine, or all these other very, very lightweight frameworks, right? That are just libraries that you import and they bring something to the table. Now, how do you now reference components coming, let's say, from module federation? Well, what if you could just have a web component, and that web component allows you then to specify what you want to have shown, which component from which micro frontend. And that's all. The rest will be then taken over by the script that you referenced. So this script is there to load, call, whatever, and orchestrate all the things that are necessary and relevant in the micro frontend space that you just now spawn here. So far, so good. And this is where we actually thought about creating something new. Now, the question will naturally come up. What's the relation between Picard and Piral? And what's the story with Piral version 2 that we announced at last year's conference? So we've been tinkering a lot with that. And as mentioned, there is this Piral base layer that we think is rather useless at the moment. And the main idea was that it is not useless. And what we want to do is we want to replace Piral base with Picard. And that will form the basis for Piral version 2. And of course, there will be still Piral core and everything. And the app shell will change a little bit. There will be a compatibility layer later on, right? And so you can still use and migrate to Piral version 2. And using that compatibility layer, even the app shell will be rather, changes there will be rather minimalistic. But there will be some changes to the app shell. There won't be any changes to the pilots. And we will also see that in the demo in a second. Picard already works with all the pilots out there, out of the box. So even if you say, I don't use anymore my Piral-based app shell, I go to some PHP-based application, it will load all the pilots and it will work. So that's a little bit the idea. So Picard is like a really small library, but this is the library. This is everything that you would need for micro frontends. And if you want more, you can either go to Piral, or you can make your own thing based on Picard. But maybe you're already happy with Picard. But let's do one step after the other. What is it that we want to provide with Picard? First of all, we want to provide it on multiple, let's say, registries. So in NPM, but also we are thinking about JSR here, so the new kid on the block. We want to provide a package that essentially contains a library that is rather simple, really to the point, and has 0 dependencies. So really you can just import it somewhere and it will just work. There's no additional installation. There will be no dependencies that need to be installed together with it. So it's already pre-bundled, if you want to, or pre-built, depending on the area of use. And this area of use actually are the different variants that we want to ship it in. So we want to support different platforms. As an example, we want to run, of course, in the browser. As you've seen, we start with HTML. You want a script reference. Well, that's the browser, right? So it should just run. You have a PHP output. You drop a script reference. It works. Great. But then again, we want to support different platforms like, for instance, Node or Dino or Bun if you want to. So server-side platforms where you also import that, but it will behave a little bit different. We come to that in a second. But the quintessence of the whole thing is that it works with or without a bundler because, well, you can drop a script reference in your browser, you can write on your single-page application, import it there and customize things, or you already work on your server-side rendered solution, I don't know, a Next.js or a plain Express application, and drop it in there, and it also works, right? And this is a little bit the idea. It ships already in this variants, and it should do the right thing on the right platform. Potentially, you need to import the right subscript from the package, but nevertheless, most of the time, you just reference Picard, and it will just do the right thing because, yeah, bundlers usually select the right exports, etc. The qualifiers usually match, and it just works from there. Now, what does it actually provide? It provides a set of, for instance, web components when it's running in the client, a set of APIs when it's running in the server, and it, of course, will be compatible with things like React and Angular, not out of the box shipping in the sense that, oh, you didn't do anything, you export from the micro frontend a React component, automatically does the right thing. But of course, based on the universal component model, it will just be compatible, and it will work with, for instance, the conversions from Piral. Potentially, it will also work with other conversions that are out there. For instance, Astro has in the integrations always such converters. Potentially, can make it compatible to this. I'm not sure how much effort it would be. That's something we look into, but it for sure will work on the converters from Piral and their new model. And it will work with the component model from SingleSpar. So if you have already a parcel from SingleSpar, for instance, it would just work with this thing out of the box. So it combines all this, and the idea, again, with Picard is not to teach you a new way to make micro frontends, but to rather have a way how to use micro frontends anywhere. And that's the thinking here. Now, what about these variants that I was talking about? So here we're looking at 3 platforms, make no mistake. I'm not here saying that's only running in Chrome or only in Node.js or only in Astro, but these are just examples for these platforms that I want to talk about. So in the browser, what we want to ship at the end of the day is a script that contains a loading mechanism for dependencies and whatnot, for understanding, for instance, a micro frontend discovery service or feed, as I name it here, and to provide a set of web components or elements that you can then use whatever is exported from micro frontends anywhere. And this behavior of this script that is then created for clients is a single scoped, meaning that once it runs in your browser, and it just assumes that this is it. This is it. There are no other users here, right? This is a single user who sits now on the screen and interacts with the site. And therefore, it also does lazy loading for everything, right? So any component, everything is lazy loaded only when you need it. The only difference is, the only crucial point is that micro frontend discovery service is, of course, requested in the beginning to already populate that, but also not with the highest priority. So other network requests have, of course, still the preference. All right, and as mentioned, it uses web components, which is quite important. Now, on the server side, this is a little bit different. Still, we have, of course, a loading mechanism to load, for instance, dependencies of microfrontends, etc. But then the feed response is there, and based on all that information that we gathered, we now can't use just web components, right? Because they would need a live document object model. Instead, what this thing does is it stringifies essentially all the renderings, if it's possible, from the universal component model that's given now from the exported components of a micro frontend. And speaking of that, it allows you also to have a dedicated endpoint in your server that delivers these fragments. So what I mean with that is that you not only have now the ability when a request comes in and you render the response, that you stringify now the usages of components of micro frontends and place it, of course, in this response, but also that you can say, hey, for this component of a certain micro frontend, render me now just how it would look like. Of course, that is a crucial part internally for the stringification part, but exposing it as an API is quite necessary in order to, for instance, do it in combination on the client, as we will see in a second. So you can expose that and just render smaller fragments of your page, which are corresponding to micro frontends or components from micro frontends. So for servers, we ship in that, and that is a little bit different than client side, because here we have multiple scopes. So essentially, you could then decide, do you keep the same scope or reuse an existing scope for this request, or do you create a new scope? And the scope is essentially all this information that comes for this user, right? And that has, of course, certain aspects to it, because the feed service you want to call just once, and you want to eagerly call it now. You don't want now that the request comes in and you're now going to the discovery service to say, hey, what microfrontends are there? It would be way too slow. And then you would maybe prefer also doing it on the client anyway. So what you want to do is you already have from the discovery service the response, and that gives you everything. But now for this particular request, you want to look at all these microfrontends and say, hey, which of these microfrontends now makes sense to render for this one user? Potentially not all microfrontends are allowed to render for this one user. And even if they are, potentially they would render differently than for another user, because maybe, you know, they're localized, or there are some statements depending on the user's role, whatever. So that they might be sensitive to the request. And so we scope this, that we don't get, let's say, in caching conflicts and reuse an existing response for the same user. But still, you already see it's multi-layered, because you can't just do everything again for every request. That would be way too resource hungry, and so we did it a little bit differently. An important part, serialization. Finally, what is now the specialization in platforms like Astro or others, where you say, hey, you have a server side, so Next.js is also an example here, and you want to do something here too, right? You already want maybe to render out a complete serialization, a complete HTML of your website. But then some parts of the site, they still have an interactive parts, like these islands, right? And you still need to hydrate them. So you need to detect that. And for these things, you want to reuse your custom elements. You want to preserve them, therefore, of course, what you did on the server. And therefore, you need to have a loader, still not as massive as beforehand, but still a loader for the dependencies and everything. And you need to have the same elements part that we saw before in the first variant. But now, key point is, we also have a connection to the fragments, because whenever you change something, like you want to have a new element in there, a new component from a micro frontend, how do you get the answer? You didn't load the discovery service micro frontends, and therefore you don't know what all exists. But what you can do is you go back to the server, and then you ask the server, which is the fragment endpoint that we discussed, render me this. And if that makes sense, you get back a rendering, and then you can rehydrate, and everything's awesome. So you have this combined use here, which is the same as the client, but a little bit different, right? And these are the three main variants that we will ship. It has a resume scope, so it's the single scope, but it takes the one that was generated on the server specifically for the request. It just resumes that, and it's eagerly lazy loaded, meaning that the server already did everything. We resume there, but now we continue in a lazy loaded fashion, and we are not doing full rendering in web components, but only hydrations. and the full rendering is always done via the fragment server. So you can see already these 3 variants, they are different, right? But they are all based on the same code base, what we will do in Picard. We just, have a build process there, combine the things that make sense for each platform, and then have the right variant in the package. And that's a little bit how we think about it. This is where I go into demos. I think I still have enough time to cover a few of these demos. Hopefully I'm not running out of time, but let's tackle one after the other. Let's start really simple, just some static HTML. And all these demos are just meant to give you the idea. I kept them all hopefully to some minimum. The last one is a little bit more extensive, but we will see when we get there. And I hope I bring over the idea. But otherwise, always just feel free to raise the question in YouTube chat or on Discord, right? So that being said, this is the static page. It's a really simple static page, so it's just some HTML I crafted together, and it uses Bootstrap, but it also uses, of course, this script that at the moment I don't get from Unpackage or so, but just, as a build artifact, and this is the script Picard.js. This, again, is just a build artifact here out of our code base. We're here in the Picard repository. Now, the whole page just shows a little bit of static content, right? We have a hello world and a Jumbotron. Awesome, I love Jumbotrons. And the page contains some fragments from Micro Frontends. Okay, what can you tell me more? Now, there are some columns. We have 3 columns. The first column, we just have some static content. But in the second column, we received from, let's say, another team, hey, we have something to provide here. This team was working on module federation, so they already gave us this URL that is rather long, but it leads to remote entry JS in something like mf simple HTML. Okay, nice name. And we refer to it here in the source attribute of a custom element called PyComponent. The name, by the way, can be changed, but by default, and this is the way where I just reference Picard.js, it is called everything pi minus. We could, of course, call it Picard, but you already see Piral starts with PI, Pilot starts with PI, now Picard is PI. We really think that Lambda is for server and Pi is for the client or for front end. But anyway, all right. So source is the one attribute. It tells now Picard where this thing can be found, and you need here, and this of course is the subject to change, so if you have a better idea, just tell me. We have a prefix that tells it this is module federation, so mf column. And now the next thing is, since it's module federation, we need to know the container, because that way it will be placed on window, and we call it simple HTML. Okay, nice. And then we have this add syntax. Again, module federation requires this kind of syntax here, and when we tell it the URL. So far, so good. Now, of course, the question is, what do we actually want to get from this container? We want to get something that we called column. So this is our import, and we're done. And we will render that here. Now, next column, we do something similar, but we want to have some micro frontend that another team gave us. And this team was using native federation. So here you got a remote entry JSON, and we have as a prefix NF. So native federation, awesome, covered. Again, they named it your column. If you think that's bad that both have the same name, it's a little bit intentional. There will be a demo where we use this, let's call it a coincidence, which is not, and we render multiple things, and stay tuned for that. And then finally, we have also a name called counter from this thing here, which leads to an index meta JSON, but this will be a pilot. So I'm using here pilot. There is no prefix. This is also, of course, something to discuss. Do we need something? So pilots are meant to be the default here. Do we really need a default? Something, again, that can be discussed. We are open here. And yeah, that's it. So source is here the pilot. The name of the component it registers is called counter. And that's it, right? So how does this page look like? Yeah, wrong address here, but it looks the same. The address might have changed, but the content did not. So we have our Jumbotron, then we have our columns, and then we have this little counter. If we look at the browser tools, what we can see is that the PyComponents, of course, remained, but Picard rendered now inside something, right? And this is already there and is nice, is working. we're happy. We got all these columns, and they were filled out now with the rendering of the different teams. And if we look at the network tab, what was happening, if we just refresh, we see it loads, Picard.js is loaded, then it loads the different entry points, so either the remote entry JS, the JSON from native federation, from Piral or the pilot with the JSON, and then we load the individual JavaScripts which lead to the one generated from native federation, the one leading to generated by module federation, and the one leading to the entry point from Piral. And that's it, right? So we rendered this whole thing. We brought together 3 different things. This is really meant to be simple. There are no dependencies in any of these microphones. It's really just simple HTML to spit out. So in that sense, it's the let's call it easiest microphones that you can deal with. But Picard just renders them. Now, this, of course, is one way where you really strongly couple it and you say, hey, I got this name and I got the source, and it might be how you do it with module federation, but you may want to leverage the power of Micro Frontend discovery service, and you can, out of the box. So what you could do is you say you reference the script, but then in the script you give it an attribute and you call that feed. And again, we are up to discussions here. So maybe you prefer a different name, like service or service URL or data minus service URL or something like this. So tell us what you think about these names. At the moment, nothing is shipped for a good reason because we want to open a discussion here. And you could say the Picard demos, and we've seen all these microphones, they were already located at this position here. We just grab this feed. So now we still can refer to the components via the Pi component custom element, but the source is much simplified. We don't have now any URL in there or any prefix. We now just refer to them by the name that was given in the discovery service. So let's have a look. Let's head over to the browser and let's see how that looks in the network tab. Let me close this and redo. So we now see that Picard demos is loaded, and this is good because this should be the only metadata necessary. It follows now this schema model that Luca presented also in the opening keynote, right? And what you can see is we got our names in here, like MF Simple HTML, and it says, oh, we got a URL here, so we know already what the remote entry JS will be. So all the information is known. We got our extras, so we know what the ID, etc. will be, and all the information can be gathered. We are happy, right? And same is of course true for all the other things like the pilot that is in there. All the extras specify the metadata for the pilot, so we know what we deal with here. All right. So that being said, the rest is then same as beforehand. So we just load then the individual things like our 48.js or the index.js or this column JS, and just load now the things to have the component finally there and rendered. Final thing in the static HTML area that I wanted to show is what you can do now with something beyond simple components. So we also have a web component called PySlot, for instance. So what a slot is very similar to a component, but instead of specifying what is the microfrontend where it comes from, you just specify the name of the component. And then all microfrontends will be queried if they provide such a name, such a component with such a name. Right, and the simplest use case is here with the counter. We just say, I don't care where it is, but if there is a counter, showcase it here. But you might even go one step further. You might say, hey, if I have components that have been registered with the name column, render them here, but don't just render them, but place them in a template, which I called here column template. So they will be placed in this div class call ID4, and they will be placed exactly where the slot is. So we will get exactly the same layout as here, where everything is then put in a column, and it will therefore resemble the same thing as beforehand, and always just a single line here. And if there would be a third microfrontend coming in, again with a column name, then we would have another column. Sure, this bootstrap layout is not really tailored for this, because then finally we would end up not with 12, but with 16 columns, which is not the number of columns that Bootstrap wants to see. But you get the idea, right? So that you can now have something with a template that really defines how these things are rendered. And in the final layout, if we have a look, it looks like this. Again, I didn't clear the network tab, but you see we're again working against our feed, and then we are loading the individual ones. So here there's no change, but if we look at the code, we see that our pie slot is here, and you see it now created these 2 additional columns so that we have actually these 3 columns. And each column, of course, then hosts a pie component, and the pie component has its rendering inside. So cool, and you see now there's a different name, so you've used the component ID that was now found out by Picard, and this component ID is just a random ID that gets generated internally. Whenever we find a new component and we create its mapping, we get it a unique ID, and therefore we can, for really fast rendering, refer to this ID. It will just work. All right. So that's just some static HTML. We could go into more depth, for instance, what about a router here? But let's do this maybe in the section about a single page application. Let's look at still the tractor version 1 example, right? Because this, is something that you might know. It looks like this at the end. You've seen that maybe countless times, and we will migrate, of course, to the tractor version 2 soon. But for the moment, we still have, of course, here tractor version 1, and yeah, it works. So it's always a good litmus test to find out if what you're doing with your framework or your idea works or doesn't. Now, what code would be needed to create this? Well, I mean, let's say it's really a single page application. So we start with a bundler here and I don't know, use React or something. Doesn't matter. You have here a code base that's based on Vite actually to have the bundling done. And I now import from Picard, but I referenced it in this repository. Maybe we should also copy over here, use that approach. But anyway, we reference it from the client part that will be built. And what we get out is a function called initialize Picard. So this is, of course, when we reference the script that we've seen earlier, we've done automatically and there's nothing to do. With this approach here, we can, of course, customize it and play around with it. So for instance, I give it here a feed. This feed contains all the micro frontends that will be shown of, in this case, blue and green. The red part we will deal in here, just to showcase how that looks like. Now, this thing was already developed way before we had any idea of Picard. So I needed a little bit more because those have been pilots. And Picard doesn't really, I mean, it knows how pilots are structured, etc., but it doesn't know so much about the API. That has changed fundamentally. But luckily, there's a services thing. We can inject a service for extending pilots. So what we do here is we extend the pilot API and we bring in some missing APIs that are not there out of the box in Picard, like register extension, we just call register component, which is there out of the box in Picard, and create state, that's also not there in the Picard, but we can easily either bring it in then later on from Piral. In this case, I just re-implemented it really, really simple. But that's not the main part. You could also then share dependencies centrally. So ideally, these microphones that you have are done, let's say, with module federation and use distributed sharing. So you have no problem there. But if you have a scenario like here, where you have a pilot and that one assumes a certain dependency to be already available, like React, you can, of course, do this with Picard as well. You just place it in there. Again, there's no build tooling. I don't use the Piral CLI or anything. It just works with any bundler that's out there. So all you do here is you share React, and that's it. The rest is rather simple because here I just render my product page. Only thing to note in here is we are using our web components, Py component. We name them, we give them the source. This is essentially the same that you've seen before, and right in the example with static HTML, and it just works here as well. And the end result is, again, what you can expect here, a working application where these boundaries are fully defined by Py components, like here the basket info, for instance, fully rendered by the system. of Picard. All right. Now, that's a single-page application. What else? You might ask about routing, and there are multiple ways to solve routing. I just want to give you one really simple idea. Hopefully get the... Let's see, is this right? Yeah. So one thing that Picard can also use out of the box is client-side routing, and it doesn't need direct route or anything for it. So what it does is it creates a special kind of convention where it prefixes your slot components. So in this case, if you have a slot with a rel router, then it will be able to, let's say, hijack that and react to changes of it. So for instance, if I now click on About, the history changes, history API, Picard knows about it, and Picard will just change automatically this name here, and it will change it to page:/about, so essentially the page we see here, and then it matches inside via, let's say, a standard route matching, also to get, let's say, parameters out of the route, and match, of course, what component you have already registered for it. So you wouldn't register, let's say, pages like you do in Piral, where you have register pages, still register just a component. The only thing that changes is that your register is now as a page : whatever route you want to have, and Picard takes care of the rest. But you can already see what's the escape hatch if you have a pilot and how it transforms, because if you call the register page API on a pilot, it would of Picard just call register page and, you know, make page : whatever route you gave it, and it would just work. The beauty about it is that I could, of course, also fake it. I can just change here in the browser, and it would just automatically then say, oh, by the way, my attribute changed. What do I need to do to get this state? Now, of course, that is not so nice to do, because now I have a mismatch between the history API and what we see here. But you get the idea that all you need to do is really change this part of the system, and Picard will take care that it just does the right thing. All right, so a couple more things to do before we can wrap up. But yeah, let's talk about server-side rendering before we call it a day, right? Now, I already told you this thing was tuned for multiple platforms. So here we have a server-side rendered example. Let me just see, it's still working good. And if I click somewhere, I have full refreshes. So you can see that, of course, in the network tab. You click somewhere and everything is loaded again. You click somewhere, okay. I can click on the basket, and I add some items, and I click around, right? The basket remains the same, and I always load this page. It's fully server-side rendered. There's no single JavaScript that's reaching here the client, so this thing will still work. If I disable JavaScript, it just works. So how does it do that? Well, I mean, it just uses a different variant than what we've seen beforehand. What we see here is that we start, of course, with everything, and you import initialize Picard now from later on the server-side variant of Picard, which ideally will be picked automatically for you. In the worst case, you do it via submodule selector, but anyway, and then it looks very much the same what you've seen beforehand. We are using now a different feed, because beforehand we were using client-side routing and everything. Now the microfrontends in this feed, well, they don't assume anything, they just has a user form that goes back. You could now go into the direction of having all these multiple scopes. I didn't. This, again, this demo is not meant to showcase this. You can always use Express session and have a cookie in there and, you know, map that. Didn't do it here. Just have a count that's global. So any other user that would access it here would see the same count. Again, that was the main part of it, and we handle just this post here, which is done when you click the button for buying one of these tractors, right? The other thing that's relevant here is that we use the decorate API of Picard, which is then capable of looking at a certain content here of the product page and then translating it, because on the product page, we are still using these Py components. But then again, Picard kicks in on the server side, and the outcome is that if we look at the generated source code, it's a little bit small, but bear with me, then you see that already we have this basket in there, right? So everything is already fully filled out, and Picard already did all that for you. So you don't need to worry about it. It transports something that's completely server-side rendered. Therefore, you can disable JavaScript and everything. The web components are still in there. I mean, if you disable JavaScript, they will just not turn on, but the content will still be displayed. And if you have the JavaScript, they can now hydrate, but that would be part of the hydration demo that I may not have time to come to. But yeah, let's see about once I present the roadmap. All right, so we had a lot of things, and I really am eager to get your feedback. What's the roadmap now for this whole thing? We are now in June, and we are heading now into the first release with all the examples that you've seen here and even more, and the documentation page being out there, and of course, giving you, let's say, getting started that should be useful at this point in time. But of course, we want to get a little bit further. So what we will do is in July, we will have articles and also first integrations available. And one of the first integrations will not be Astro, but it will be among the first. The first one will be Piral Blazor Server. It was asked today already on the Discord channel, and there we are still a little bit waiting for the 0.5. It should now come next week or so. Sorry for the delay, but the server side is still full Blazor part. But then, of course, it has this variant of Picard that takes over on the client side and then works against the server, which transports into fragments. But it has a lot of benefits because, well, pretty much the whole reading out and micro frontend discovery service, etc., you do in Blazor, but all the rest is then kicked off on the client again. So we got this pre-rendering and all the interactivity done by Blazor, of course, via the WebSocket and whatnot, or WebAssembly. But then, of course, for all the rest, or maybe changing a microfrontend component, we still call the fragment API that just works in tandem again. So the fragment API on the server needs to be implemented in Blazor using .NET. But then again, client side is Picard, it will just take care of that. In August, we are already planning to have a 0.1 release, so it's end of August, something like this, maybe start of September. And that's why we want now to open this discussion to have now good pre-releases of that and then have a 1.0 already there. Because again, Picard is meant to be rather small and we don't want to blow it up. There will be no CLI or anything. It will not help you with an emulator or anything. This is Piral's job. Picard's job is just to enable the use of microfrontends anywhere. And in November, we want to have the first pre-release of Piral version 2, what we announced last year that will come, and it now uses Picard.js as a basis instead of Piral base. Now, I still have the Islands and Dynamic Hydration demo, but potentially we already have some comments, and I think also maybe I can use it among my final words then later on. So I would defer this demo now and get over to have some questions answered and maybe fulfill someone's dream of winning in a raffle. That would be really awesome. And with that, thanks for the attention, and let's hear it now.
Thank you, Florian. Very cool talk. Thanks a lot. And the audience also, like, just reading the comments, they seem to be super excited to get their hands on Picard for the first time, and also what that means for Piral version 2. And we also have a question in this context. So Robson is asking, what does it mean for the future Piral version 2 plugin like dashboard or menu? Would that be then implemented using web components instead of restricted to React?
Yeah, the answer is there a little bit. Also, it depends. Now, what you do right now in Piral with your pilots wouldn't change. Potentially, of course, if you would start from scratch, it would change. But the last thing you want to do, and we always said that, and I want to reiterate it again, because this is one of the things we promised, and this is a promise that is not negotiable. There will be no changes required to pilots, meaning that if you do today, you use dashboard with the Piral dashboard plugin for Piral, and therefore you have a register tile API, and you use that API in your pilot, and you migrate now your app shell to version 2, there might be multiple steps needed for doing that, but anyway, your pilot doesn't need to change. And it will just work, and your dashboard tile will still be React-based. And so the whole thing will keep working in that sense. Now, the story gets a little bit more complicated if we look under the hood, because what we did right now with Piral is that in React, you get a clean tree, so to speak. So you have your root node, you have other nodes, maybe then you have a component from your microfrontend, but that's just there sitting in this tree, right? Now with Picard, that tree would be broken like it is, for instance, for foreign components like Angular or whatever. And you got now your web component in there, and that hosts now your React component, which gets a new tree. So we can still optimize here. So it would not get a new React tree. It would use the React projection. These are technical details. But all I want to say is that from the perspective of the document object model, it will look a little bit different there, right? Even though it would be still one React tree, the DOM tree would change a bit with Picard. And for most people, this will not have any impact. But if you have a selector that requires that, I don't know, under a certain DOM element, there's another DOM element, and this DOM element would now come from your microfrontend component, it might not work out because there might now be a Pi component, for instance, in between, or even more, right? Like a Pi slot and a Pi component. So this could be problematic, and we are not sure yet how to deal with that in this compatibility mode. In general, it shouldn't impact anyone because, yeah, you shouldn't make this assumption in your selectors on this transition boundary, let's call it. But yeah, it can and it will happen for some, and we are still thinking how you might be able to control it. By the way, you could already today introduce such a boundary in Piral. We have a flag in your Piral JSON. It will enable this boundary too for React flows. So there is already a way to already, let's say, investigate if it would work or not. We introduced it, I think, with the 1.4 version of Piral. It's a flag no one knows, I guess, but it is, so there are ways already to check. But otherwise, regarding dashboard, etc., there's nothing needed for you to do.
Great. Thanks for the detailed answer. I think we're running out a little bit of time here. We also want to do the raffle. But I think, Florian, you're, of course, happy to answer all upcoming questions in the comment section as well.